right, folks, you're still listening to The True Presbyterian, but it's after the interview now, so you can feel free to throw on a pair of fuzzy bunny slippers, pour yourself a bourbon and Coke, as long as you're not driving, and take a little bit of pressure off. So I'm here with Brian Sauvé. Before we get to the after the interview questions, though, I've got to ask: is that a Wilderness Warrior shirt that I'm seeing there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Got to rep the Wilderness Warriors.
All right, my man Eric Kahn. For those of you who are listening, Eric is coming on at the end of the season. I've actually already got that episode recorded and in the hopper, so that's going to
Excellent.
be a fun one. All right, so for season 3, we've been doing a little mini series on how sermons work. And so I've listened to a couple of your sermons because I like to get to know a little bit about my guests before I have them come on. And you're a guy who preaches pretty well. But every pastor I know has had the experience where they've walked out of the pulpit and just been like, oh, that wasn't good. That wasn't good at all.
Yep.
And sometimes you're right, and it wasn't good. And other times people come up to you afterwards and like, that's the best sermon you've ever preached. And
Yep.
then you walk away from church going, clearly, I don't know what I'm doing. So for you, what was like the sermon that you remember that sticks out in your head that you're like, that was the worst sermon ever?
Well, it's painful to think back. These are I have a chest in my memory that I lock up. I put them there and I just leave them there because after you've
Yeah.
learned what went wrong, you just put it there and forget it. It
Right, sure.
it At first I thought, well, maybe it was the time in Genesis, which was the first book that I chose to preach through. I had inherited a sermon series when I first started preaching. That was my first, maybe halfway through that sermon series, 20 sermons in. We were doing 2 services, and I preached a sermon, and in the between the services time, a gentleman came up, and he was like, Pastor Brian, I think not only did you make a mistake in your exegesis, but I actually think that it was the central point of your whole sermon.
Oh,
And he was right.
no.
He was totally right. I was just wrong. And so I
Oh,
had to just
man.
preach a new sermon because I wasn't going to give the second service the error again. That was not the worst sermon I've ever preached. So that tells you
Okay.
that tells you the worst sermon I ever preached is no question, not even my fault 100%. It was I had told my youth pastor, I think, I feel called to ministry and teaching. And he said, "Okay, I'm going to have you teach in the youth group." And he called it, "I'm going to have you, preach this," because I was in a mega church environment where youth group was just a replication of the church service with just teenagers in the room, which is a terrible idea. Don't do that. And this was at the time when Rob Bell was still, it was pre-farewell Rob Bell from John Piper, but anybody with a lot of discernment would have known. And I pretty much just I think I preached on a text, but it was pretty much like why Rob Bell was brilliant on this point. And when I think about that teaching, I just think someone in the room should have come up and patted me on the head and said, "That thanks for that. Go, you can have a seat. We'll keep going from now." And
Right, right.
oh man, I cringe when I think about
In
that time.
fairness to you, brother, I don't know if your first sermon should even count. Right?
No,
I mean, I
no.
think we just reject that one from the list out of hand, or like,
Yep.
okay, let's look for something where I kind of actually knew what I was doing to an
Yeah.
extent. So, are there areas, because look, I feel this for myself, right? I mean, I don't know any pastor who ever walks out of the pulpit and is completely happy with the sermon that they just preached.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody that that's true for. So, but over time, you start to identify some things in yourself and go, okay, I have a weakness in my preaching here.
Hmm.
And so, what's like, where is that for you? Because I
Yeah.
can absolutely identify it for myself.
Hmm.
I didn't come from the um, sort of Christocentric preaching Christ from the Old Testament school.
Hmm.
And so that's an area where I have a really hard time. So I'm wondering where it is for you.
Yeah, man. For me, it really comes to um, it shows up in my preparation actually, where I had to learn that
Okay.
I'm not the kind of preacher that does well preaching from an outline. I have to preach from a manuscript. and
Oh,
and
okay.
maybe in 10 years that'll be different. Maybe I'll have more experience and have a couple hundred more sermons under my belt. But if I have an outline left to my own devices, I tend to just have a thought and follow it like a dog after a rabbit.
Sure.
And I'd like to think that maybe now, having manuscripted for a few years, I'd be able to identify that temptation and say no in the moment. But
Mm,
I preached too long, not focused enough, said wrong things occasionally because I was just following a thought in the moment.
sure.
I had to recognize you're not an off the cuff guy. You need to think about this. This is a weighty
Sure.
thing. You gotta you know prep that through. So that's really what I'd point to. My biggest. I still have guards around that for myself.
Sure. So and I don't ask these questions for the folks that are listening to try and, as I say, put Brian on the spot. I say that tongue in cheek, but to recognize that for every guy that you listen to, whether you think he's a great preacher or a good preacher or a mediocre preacher or even a bad preacher, there's always an area that you can look at and go, man, I really kind of want to improve in that area. And you're not alone in this,
Mm-hmm.
right? So everybody has some weaknesses in their sermons and their sermon prep or in their preaching. And so sometimes I think there needs to be some encouragement there to go, look, it's not just you.
Yeah.
It's all of us. And to also have the reassurance that God uses even bad sermons. And if you
Mm-hmm.
want proof for that, look at the conversion of Charles Haddon Spurgeon.
Oh, right.
So,
That's good.
well, Brian, thank you again so much for joining me. I really appreciated you having or giving us your time to come on the show.
Was a pleasure. Thanks again for the invite.